Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. Chapter 179. I stayed awake until 3:47. That was the last time I looked at my watch before I fell asleep. It has a luminous face and lights up if you press a button, so I could read it in the dark. I was cold and I was frightened Father might come out and find me, but I felt safer in the garden because I was hidden. I looked at the sky a lot. I like looking up at the sky in the garden at night. In summer, I sometimes come outside at night with my torch and my planisphere, which is two circles of plastic with a pin through the middle. On the bottom is a map of the sky, and on top is an aperture, which is an opening shaped in a parabola. And you turn it around to see a map of the sky that you can see on that day of the year, from the latitude of 51.5 degrees north, which is the latitude that Swindon is on, because the largest bit of the sky is always on the other side of the Earth. And when you look at the sky, you know you're looking at the stars, which are hundreds and thousands of light years away from you. And some of the stars don't even exist anymore because their light has taken so long to get to us that they are already dead, or they've exploded and collapsed into red dwarfs. And that makes you seem very small. When you have difficult things in your life, it's nice to think that they are what is called negligible, which means that they are so small you don't have to take them into account when you are calculating something. I didn't sleep very well because of the cold and because the ground was very bumpy and pointy underneath me, and because Toby was scratching in his cage a lot. But when I woke up properly, it was dawn, and the sky was all orange and blue and purple, and I could hear birds singing, which is called the dawn chorus. And I stayed where I was for another 2 hours and 32 minutes, and then I heard Father come into the garden and call out, "Christopher? Christopher?" So I turned round, and I found an old plastic sack covered in mud that used to have fertilizer in it, and I squeezed myself and Toby's cage and my special food box into the corner between the wall of the shed and the fence and the rainwater tub, and I covered myself with the fertilizer sack. Then I heard Father coming down the garden, and I took my Swiss Army knife out of my pocket and got out the saw blade and held it in case he found us. And I heard him open the door of the shed and look inside, and then I heard him say, "Shit." And then I heard his footsteps in the bushes around the side of the shed, and my heart was beating really fast. I could feel the feeling like a balloon inside my chest again. And I think he might have looked around back of the shed, but I couldn't see because I was hiding. But he didn't see me because I heard him walking back up the garden again. Then I stayed still and looked at my watch, and I stayed still for 27 minutes. And then I heard Father start the engine of his van. I knew it was his van because I heard it very often, and it was nearby. And I knew it wasn't any of the neighbors' cars because the people who take drugs have a Volkswagen camper van. Mr. Thompson, who lives at number 40, has a Vauxhall Cavalier. The people who live at number 34 have a Peugeot, and they all sound different. And when I heard him drive away from the house, I knew it would be safe to come out. Then I had to decide what to do because I couldn't live in the house with Father anymore because it was dangerous. So I made a decision. I decided that I would go and knock on Mrs. Shears's door, and I would go and live with her because I knew her and she wasn't a stranger, and I had stayed in her house before. And there was a power cut on our side of the street. And this time she wouldn't tell me to go away because I would be able to tell her who had killed Wellington, and that way she would know that I was a friend. And also she would understand why I couldn't live with Father anymore. I took the licorice laces and the pink wafer biscuit and the last clementine out of my special food box and put them in my pocket and hid the special food box under the fertilizer bag. Then I picked up Toby's cage and my extra coat and I climbed out from behind the shed. I walked up the garden and down the side of the house. I undid the bolt in the garden door and walked out in front of the house. There was no one in the street, so I crossed and walked up the drive to Mr. Shears's house and knocked on the door and waited and worked out what I was going to say when she opened the door. But she didn't come to the door, so I knocked again. Then I turned around and saw some people walking down the street, and I was frightened again because it was two of the people who take drugs in the house next door. So I grabbed Toby's cage and went around the side of Mrs. Shears's house and sat down behind the dustbin so they couldn't see me. Then I had to work out what to do. And I did this by thinking of all the things I could do and deciding whether they were the right decision or not. I decided that I couldn't go home again. I decided that I couldn't go and live with Shaban because she couldn't look after me when school was closed because she was a teacher and not a friend or a member of my family. And I decided that I couldn't go and live with Uncle Terry because he lived in Sunderland, and I didn't know how to get to Sunderland. And I didn't like Uncle Terry because he smoked cigarettes and stroked my hair. And I decided I couldn't go and live with Mrs. Alexander because she wasn't a friend or a member of the family, even if she had a dog, because I couldn't stay overnight in her house or use her toilet because she had used it and she was a stranger. And then I thought that I could go and live with Mother because she was my family and I knew where she lived because I could remember the address from the letters, which was 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG. Except that she lived in London and I'd never been to London before. I'd only been to Dover to go to France and to Sunderland to visit Uncle Terry, and to Manchester to visit Aunt Ruth, who had cancer, except she didn't have cancer when I was there, and I'd never been anywhere apart from the shop at the end of the road on my own. And the thought of going somewhere on my own was frightening. Then I thought about going home again, or staying where I was, or hiding in the garden every night, and Father finding me, and that made me feel even more frightened. When I thought about that, I felt like I was going to be sick again, like I did the night before. And then I realized there was nothing I could do, which felt safe, and I made a picture of it in my head like this. Now, living with Mr. Shears, going home, staying in the garden, going to live with Uncle Terry, going to live with Mother. And then I imagined it crossing out all the possibilities which were impossible, which is like in a maths exam when you look at all the questions, you decide which ones you're going to do and which ones you're not going to do, and you cross out all the ones which you're not going to do because then your decision is final and you can't change your mind. It was like this. Crossed out the following things: living with Mr. Shears, going home, staying in the garden, going to live with Uncle Terry. Which meant that I had to go to London to live with Mother. And I could do it by going on a train because I knew all about trains from the train set. How you looked at the timetable and went to the station and bought a ticket and looked at the departure board to see if your train was on time. Then you went to the right platform and got on board. And I would go from Swindon Station, where Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson stopped for lunch when they were on their way, to Ross from Paddington in the Boscombe Valley Mystery. Then I looked at the wall on the opposite side of the little passage down the side of Mrs. Shears's house where I was sitting, and there was the circular lid of a very old metal pan leaning against the wall, and it was covered in rust. And it looked like the surface of a planet because the rust was shaped like countries and continents and islands. And I thought how I could never be an astronaut because being an astronaut meant being hundreds of thousands of miles away from home. My home was in London now, and that was about 100 miles away. It was more than 1,000 times nearer than my home would be if I was in space. And thinking about this made me hurt. Like when I fell over in the grass at the edge of a playground once and I cut my knee on a piece of broken bottle that someone had thrown over the wall, and I sliced a flap of skin off, and Mr. Davis had to clean the flesh under the flap with disinfectant to get the germs and the dirt out, and it hurt so much I cried. But this hurt was inside my head. It made me sad to think I could never become an astronaut. And then I thought that I had to be like Sherlock Holmes, and I had to detach my mind at will to a remarkable degree, that I did not notice how much it was hurting inside my head. And then I thought I would need money if I was going to go to London. And I would need food to eat because it was a long journey, and I wouldn't know where to get food from. And I thought I would need someone to look after Toby when I went to London, because I couldn't take him with me. And then I formulated a plan, and that made me feel better because there was something in my head that had an order and a pattern, and I just had to follow the instructions one after the other. I stood up and I made sure that there was no one in the street. Then I went to Mrs. Alexander's house, which is next door to Mrs. Shears's house, and I knocked on the door. Then Mrs. Alexander opened the door and she said, "Christopher, what on earth has happened to you?" And I said, "Can you look after Toby for me?" And she said, "Who's Toby?" And I said, "Toby's my pet rat." Then Mrs. Alexander said, Oh, yes, I remember now. You told me." Then I held Toby's cage up and said, "This is him." Mrs. Alexander took a step backward into her hallway, and I said, "He eats special pellets, and you can buy them from a pet shop. But he can also eat biscuits and carrots and bread and chicken bones. But you mustn't give him chocolate because it's got caffeine and theobromine in it, which are methylxanthines, and it's poisonous for rats in large quantities. And he needs new water in his bottle every day, too, and he won't mind being in someone else's house because he's an animal. He likes to come out of his cage, but it doesn't matter if you don't take him out." Then Mrs. Alexander said, "Why do you need someone to look after Toby, Christopher?" And I said, "I'm going to London." And she said, "How long are you going for?" And I said, "Until I go to university." And she said, "Can't you take Toby with you?" And I said, "London's a long way away, and I don't want to take him on the train because I might lose him." And Mrs. Alexander said, "Right." And then she said, "Are you and your father moving house?" And I said, "No." And she said, "So why are you going to London?" And I said, "I'm going to live with Mother." And she said, "I thought you told me your mother was dead." And I said, "I thought she was dead, but she was still alive, and Father lied to me. And also he said he killed Wellington." Mrs. Alexander said, "Oh my goodness." And I said, "I'm going to live with my mother because Father killed Wellington and he lied, and I'm frightened of being in the house with him." And Mrs. Alexander said, "Is your mother here?" And I said, "No, Mother is in London." She said, "So you're going to London on your own?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Look, Christopher, why don't you come inside and sit down and we can talk about this and work out what is the best thing to do?" And I said, "No, I can't come inside. Will you look after Toby for me?" And she said, I really don't think that would be a good idea, Christopher. And I didn't say anything. And she said, where's your father at the moment? And I said, I don't know. And she said, well, perhaps we should try and give him a ring and see if you can get in touch with him. I'm sure he's worried about you. And I'm sure that there's been some dreadful misunderstanding. So I turned around and I ran across the road back to our house, and I didn't look before I crossed the road, and a yellow Mini had to stop, and the tires squealed on the road. And I ran down the side of the house and back to the garden gate, and I bolted it behind me. I tried to open the kitchen door, but it was locked, so I picked up a brick that was lying on the ground, and I smashed it through the window, and the glass shattered everywhere. Then I put my arm through the broken glass, and I opened the door from the inside. I went into the house, and I put Toby down on the kitchen table. Then I ran upstairs, and I grabbed my school bag, and I put some food for Toby in it, and some of my math books, and some clean pants, and a vest, and a clean shirt. Then I came downstairs, and I opened the fridge, and I put a carton of orange juice into my bag and a bottle of milk that hadn't been opened. And I took 2 more clementines and 2 tins of baked beans and a pack of custard creams from the cupboard, and I put them in my bag as well, because I could open them with a can opener or my Swiss Army knife. Then I looked on the surface next to the sink, and I saw Father's mobile phone and his wallet and his address book, and I felt my skin cold under my clothes, like Dr. Watson in Sign of 4 when he sees the tiny footsteps of Tonga, the Andaman Islander, on the roof of Bartholomew Sholo's house in Norwood, because I thought Father had come back and he was in the house, and the pain in my head got much worse. But then I rewound the pictures into my memory, and I saw that his van wasn't parked outside the house, so he must have left his mobile phone and his wallet and his address book when he left the house. I picked up his wallet and I took his bank card out because that was how I could get money, because the card has a PIN, which is the secret code which you put into the machine at the bank to get money out. And Father hadn't written it down in a safe place, which is what you're meant to do. He had told me because he said I'd never forget it. And it was 3558. And I put the card into my pocket. Then I took Toby out of his cage and put it into the pocket of one of my coats because the cage was very heavy to carry all the way to London. And then I went out of the kitchen door into the garden again. I went out through the garden gate and made sure there wasn't anyone watching, and then I started walking toward the school because that was the direction I knew. When I got to school, I could ask Shaban where the train station was. Normally, I would have gotten more and more frightened if I was walking to school because I had never done it before, but I was frightened in 2 different ways. And one way was being frightened of being far away from a place I was used to, and the other was being frightened of being near where Father lived, and they were in inverse proportion to one another. So the total fear remained a constant as I got further away from home, further away from Father, like this. It takes 19 minutes for the bus to get to school from our house, but it took me 47 minutes to walk the same distance, so I was very tired when I got there, and I hoped that I could stay at school for a little while and have some biscuits and some orange juice before I went to the train station. But I couldn't, because when I got to the school, I saw that Father's van was parked outside in the car park. I knew it was his van because it said Ed Boone Heating, Maintenance, and Boiler Repair on the side with a crossed spanners sign like this. When I saw the van, I was sick again, but I knew I was going to be sick this time, so I didn't sick all over myself, and I was just sick onto the wall and the pavement. There wasn't very much sick because I hadn't eaten much. When I had been sick, I wanted to curl up on the ground and do groaning, but I knew that if I curled up on the ground and did groaning, then Father would come out of the school and he would see me and he would catch me and take me home. So I took lots of deep breaths, like Siobhan says I have to do if someone hits me at school, and I counted 50 breaths, and I concentrated very hard on the numbers and did their cubes as I said them, and that made the hurt less painful. Then I cleaned the sick away from my mouth, and I made a decision that I would have to find out how to get to the train station, and I would do this by asking someone. And it would be a lady, because when they talk to us about stranger danger at school, they say that if a man comes up to you and talks to you and you feel frightened, you should call out and find a lady to run to, because ladies are safer. So I got out my Swiss Army knife, and I flicked out the saw blade, and I held it tightly in the pocket that Toby wasn't in, so that I could stab someone if they grabbed hold of me. And then I saw a lady on the other side of the street with a baby in a pushchair and a little boy with a toy elephant, so I decided to ask her. This time I looked left and right and left again so that I wouldn't be run over by a car, and I crossed the road. And I said to the lady, "Where can I buy a map?" And she said, "Pardon?" And I said, "Where can I buy a map?" And I could feel the hand that was holding the knife shaking, even though I wasn't shaking it. She said, "Patrick, put that down, it's dirty." "A map of where?" And I said, "A map of here." And she said, "I don't know." And then she said, "Where do you want to get to?" And I said, "I'm going to the train station." And she laughed and she said, "You don't need a map to get to the train station." And I said, "I do, because I don't know where the train station is." And she said, "You can see it from here." And I said, "No, I can't. And also I need to know where there is a cash machine." And she pointed and said, "There, that building says Signal Point on the top. There's a British Rail sign on the other end. The station's at the bottom of that. Patrick, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. Don't pick things off the pavement and stick them in your mouth." And I looked and I could see a building with writing at the top, but it was a long way away, so it was hard to read. And I said, "Do you mean the stripy building with the horizontal windows?" And she said, "That's the one." And I said, "How do I get to that building?" And she said, "Gordon Bennett." And then she said, "Follow that bus." And she pointed to a bus that was going past. So I started to run, but buses go really fast, and I had to make sure that Toby didn't fall out of my pocket. But I managed to keep running after the bus for a long way, and I crossed 6 side roads before it turned down another street, and I couldn't see it anymore. Then I stopped running because I was breathing really hard and my legs hurt. I was in the street with lots of shops, and I remembered being in the street when I went shopping with Mother, and there were lots of people in the street doing their shopping, but I didn't want them to touch me, so I walked at the edge of the road. And I didn't like all the people being near me and all the noise because it was too much information in my head and it made it hard to think, like there was shouting in my head. So I put my hands over my ears and I groaned very quietly. And then I noticed that I could still see the sign that the lady had pointed at, so I kept walking toward it. And then I couldn't see the sign anymore, and I'd forgotten to remember where it was, and this was frightening because I was lost and because I do not forget things. Normally, I would make a map in my head, and I would follow the map, and there would be a little cross on the map that showed where I was. There was too much interference in my head, and this had made me confused. So I stood under the green and white canvas roof outside a greengrocer's shop where there were carrots and onions and parsnips and broccoli in boxes that had a plastic fur green carpet in them, and I made a plan. I knew that the train station was somewhere near, and if something is nearby, you can find it by moving in a spiral, walking clockwise and taking every right turn until you come back to a road you've already walked on, then taking the next left, then taking every right turn, and so on, like this. This is a hypothetical diagram, too, and not a map of Swindon. That was how I found the train station. I concentrated really hard on following the rules and making a map of the center of the town in my head as I walked, and that way it was easier to ignore all the people and all the noise around me. And then I went into the train station.